Hello, I'm Professor Richard Wilding from Cranfield University. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. And we're going to be talking about a really interesting subject, a bit of vision of where potentially we're going to be going in, well, the not too distant future, really looking at supply chain 2035. So let's move into the presentation proper and just to have some reflections on what we're actually doing. You can see there, do follow me on Twitter and also on LinkedIn. So let's get into things. Just a couple of important things really, which it's worth just actually thinking about. My background is a bit eclectic. I accidentally fell into academia, so that just gives you a bit of my perspective. I describe myself as a pracademic, a practitioner academic. I'm an engineer by background. That's where I started my career. I'm also a logistics and a supply chain professional, fellow of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. Procurement, a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, and also I do an awful lot of work within higher education. So I'm a national teaching fellow. My daughter actually says if you rearrange all the letters within all these letters after my name, it says I talk complete and utter rubbish, or something like that. I think there's a B and an S in there or something like that. But anyway, that's what is a bit on my background. Very importantly, I'm Professor and Chair of Supply Chain Strategy at Cranfield University. And Cranfield's very different. It's basically all about technology and management. So we've got people working really very much on the technology side, and we've also got people working on the management side. So really during this presentation, I'm going to have my feet in both of these areas as we move forward. And yes, I was former chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, all associated with movement of goods and people and associated supply chains. So really what I want to be able to do is to bring some of the learnings from the last 18 months into this, but also very much be looking to the future of where we see certain things going at this time. So where do we work as an organization? Well, we work globally, and I think that's really important because we're getting very many global perspectives from organizations. Europe, has particular focuses, but so does Asia at the moment, as particularly as we're moving sort of through the pandemic times as we are at the moment. Some areas coming out of lockdown, some areas going back into lockdown. So it is a little bit challenging. And critically for this session, what I do want to do is to just share some ideas with you. I describe innovation as taking ideas which are new to you. Innovation is all about creating value, economic value, social value, and or environmental value through the application of ideas that are new to you. So hopefully I'm going to share some ideas, and I do hope that you're going to be able to take these, get them back into your business and really create some value for your organization and also for the environment and our society as a whole. So, I often describe my role actually is to challenge and inspire supply chain leaders to innovate. So that's really the perspective that I'm going to be coming from. So what are we going to be talking about during this particular session? Well, I want to talk about the foundations of supply chain strategy as we move into 2035. So thinking about supply chain strategy, it's a really important focus that we need to have. One of the other things that we need to actually think through is something called the supply chain arcs of integration, control, and influence. And this is really something that we're finding a lot of companies are having to reflect on at the moment, is how integrated that overall supply chain network is, because competition is no longer between individual companies, but between the supply chains they are part of. And it's not a chain, it's a network. So we've got this whole network that we're having to sort of think through and coordinate. And then there are a couple of real challenges that we need to start thinking about today in planning for 2035, but also think about today for planning for, believe it or not, 2050. So we need to be able to think through these. And there's a couple of things which are very much on people's agendas at the moment. So I'm going to talk about ESG, environment, social and governance risks. So this is really important, and show you an example of how companies are starting to reflect on that. We're going to talk a little bit about net zero 2050, because that has big implications for what we're doing in warehousing, what we're actually doing in terms of our transport operations, and so on and so forth. Share an executive board debate, which is very much taking place at the moment, and then think through some resilience lessons as we move towards a new better. We talk about the new normal, but actually if we go about this in the right way, we're going to be creating a new better. So that's really where I want to go with this particular session. So I'm going to start off with this. Surviving the VUCA world. We've got this lovely term VUCA, as somebody on, I think it was the BBC, when I was doing an interview and I shared this term, said it sounds like some heavy rock band. Well, the point is it's all about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That is the type of world we're operating in at the moment. And some work which we did at Cranfield a number of years ago is really looking at something called the Volatility Index. And this index, quite simply, was lots and lots of different variables, be it exchange rates, be it, metal prices, oil prices. It was looking at, even shipping prices, Baltic Dry Index, and so on and so forth. So a whole raft of different factors. And what we actually discovered was that, hey, and it's not probably a big surprise, that things are getting more and more volatile as we go on. And this only went to around about 2015. I hate to think what things look like after the last sort of 18 months to 2 years in terms of the amount of volatility that we're actually experiencing. The point is, though, that we have to reflect on is a lot of our management practices, a lot of the processes, the networks we've put in place, information systems, and even the skills of the people and the way we've developed people. Sadly, we've been doing probably similar things now based on, if you like, research and based on our activities maybe 30 plus years ago. So the challenge is that the world has suddenly changed. It's become more VUCA, and actually we need to think very differently about things as we move forward. So when we start to then reflect on supply chain strategy, and this is really important, we have to actually sort of start off with that whole area of the corporate strategy at the top of the business. I'm just going to get my little highlighter here to just share with you, sort of make things a little work. So up here we've got the corporate strategy of the business, and hopefully you can see this little dot here which I'm wiggling around, and this is really often about the whole issue of what is our business doing. Most corporate strategies involve global domination. It's a bit like Dr. Evil having to think through how we're going to conquer the planet. But the corporate strategy, it's how can we actually provide a service in a particular globally. What is our business about? But where things get interesting for me is what we call the competitive strategy. Competitive strategy is all about how we create value for particular customers. And the competitive strategy will be different for different products, but also for different customers. It's, for different products, people will have different desires for that individual product. It'll be set to a particular market or group of people, but also different customers. Some customers want everything within 2 hours. Other customers are quite happy to wait a few days. So once again, the competitive strategy, how we're creating value, becomes very important. This is also about demand creation. So that's a really important area that we need to deal with. We then have the supply chain strategy. Supply chain strategy is how we deliver value. Okay, so this is, if you like, our, how we fulfill and deliver that value into the particular marketplace. So importantly, these people in your business who work in these areas need to really work very closely indeed together. So often competitive strategy, it might be marketing, sales, commercial teams. The supply chain strategy may be more your operations type people and supply chain type people. But the point is, everything that the supply chain does needs to create value for the final customer. So you've got to have great collaboration between these people in here. And really in simple terms, and it is slightly simplistic, but it works, all right? We then have to reflect on, okay, for a particular way of creating value in a particular marketplace, it could be on, say one market, it might be all about availability. The other market might be about affordability. How do we make things as affordable as possible compared with how do we make sure we've got things as available as possible? And that will change the supply chain process design, the infrastructure and equipment that we're actually using as well, the information systems design which is needed, and also very importantly, the people design. If you like, well, people design, it's the organizational design, but also the skills of the people. And you'll notice there's a link which goes back around here, because some of the things that we're actually doing in terms of the supply chain gives us new ways of creating value for our final customer. Now, why is this so important for 2035? Because one of the things that we have seen recently is massive changes in terms of what customers value. And therefore, our supply chains have to adapt. As I've been telling people, if your supply chain is going to be the same in 2021 as it was in 2019, you're probably doing something wrong. Now, the point is if you get this wrong, what starts to happen is all the cost to serve starts to change, because all of a sudden, if you've got an inappropriate infrastructure, for example, for a particular market, I mean, just think about the shift to online, which we've experienced. If you're still using, if you like, the same mechanism to serve that online market that you were doing, a number of years ago, there is a real high likelihood that your cost to serve has gone through the roof. And therefore, you might have your sales going up, but your profits are going down. And that's something that many of us have sort of experienced over the past few years. So that becomes a really important area that we need to sort of reflect on and cover. So let's just think then in terms of the supply chain strategy, the bimodal supply chain, really important concept, because what we've seen is we talk about mode 1 and mode 2. Mode 1 is a focus on predictability. Mode 2 is all about exploration. Mode 1 is all about lean, and that's been very much a trend we've seen for a number of years now. Mode 2 is all about exploration, it's agile. And I think in the old normal, back end of 2019, you would look at a business and you would see that probably around about 80% of what we're doing was in that mode 1 box, as it were. It was operating in that particular area. What we now find is probably 80% of what we're doing is having to operate in that mode 2 box. So going back to the processes we have, the infrastructure equipment we have, the information systems, and also the people skills and the organization, are we in a position which our organization can now cope with that high proportion of what we're doing being in that mode 2 area, of operations? So organizations need to learn to manage both modes simultaneously, but also accept that we're having to move into this time of really, just big exploration in terms of testing things out. Has a big impact on things like capital expenditure proposals, because sometimes we've just got to try things to see if it works so we can create that value for our customers. So this becomes really quite important. Now, supporting all of that is, if you like, supply chain 4.0, and we're going to see more and more of this. So in the back end of 2019, when I was talking about supply chain 4.0, we were talking about autonomous vehicles, we were talking about collaborative robotics taking place in warehouses, we were talking about, the implementations and rises in home delivery, and thinking very, very differently about how things were going to move forward, how technology was going to enable us to work more remotely, and so on and so forth. And what we've actually discovered is I was in back end of 2019, I was predicting, in the next 5 years, pandemic came. This created an almighty burning platform underneath all of this. And what we suddenly found was things that I thought we wouldn't get really in place in many organizations for 5 years, it was suddenly 5 months and even 5 weeks on occasions. And also the costs of implementing that dropped dramatically as people started to think very differently about it. And if we look at these 9 components, we have, for example, the whole issue of systems integration. Okay, absolutely critical now. Big data and analytics, which are taking place across the supply chain, monitoring what's going on. Simulation and virtualization, you know, being able to sort of take the data, build that digital twin so that you can actually test out different ways of operating. The Internet of Things, of course, cloud computing, cybersecurity, I think it should be number 1. We've seen lots of businesses which have been severely disrupted because of cybersecurity around their supply chain systems. This is something that, you know, various people are just trying to disrupt now. If you want to disrupt a company, you go for their supply chain systems, no doubt about it. So we've got to think very carefully about that, and we're all responsible for that. So as supply chain professionals, logistics professionals, we need to be very alert to cybersecurity. Autonomous systems, you know, so, you know, automated systems, augmented reality. This is things like, you know, even vision picking taking place in warehouses, additive manufacturing. These are the building blocks. And what we find is, even, you know, if you talk about blockchain, what it's doing is it's taking cybersecurity, it's taking the cloud, you know, for the distributed ledger, it's using these building blocks to create new models. And this is what we're finding as supply chain professionals. We're able to take these and we're taking and combining elements of these to create different ways to create value. And we've found that the planets have now aligned on this. So this is really moving forward at quite a pace. So in 2035, we're going to see an awful lot more going on in this whole area. So then, in order to be able to prepare for that and to think through that, I want to talk about supply chain integration. Now, supply chain integration is about coordinating and synchronizing the flow of information, the flow of material, and the flow of cash. You know, the cash is absolutely critical for any supply chain network. If an organization in that network or a bit of that network doesn't have the cash, okay, basically it will die. And we need that, you know, that whole body, that whole ecosystem to actually operate appropriately. You know, we've seen some bad behaviors, but also some really great behaviors taking place during the pandemic. I mean, you know, beating up suppliers, it can be, you know, if you think about it, if you start saying, well, we're going to increase payment terms, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. On small suppliers, that's a bit like, you know, getting your finger, tying a load of string around it and tightening it up so they don't get any blood into their finger, into your finger. And guess what happens? It dies. And actually, for the supply chain to operate, we need the fingers. So, you know, we have to start thinking through, you know, how we treat people. Whereas other businesses have been very good. They've said, well, okay, yeah, we need to make sure that various partners, we're going to reduce the payment terms for them and we're going to pay them faster so we can keep them alive. In other words, we're going to make sure we get the blood flow into that finger so that that business can actually operate. So we have to sort of think through this, that cash is very, very important as we think about supply chain, how we move it forward. So when we start to think through the whole issue of supply chain integration, we talk about internal integration and we talk about external integration. And to be quite honest, one of the key things that we need to think about is internal integration. You know, start getting that right, but also think about that external integration, which is taking place as well. Now, the way we often describe this is we talk about these arcs of integration. So when I'm working with businesses, I'm often getting them to reflect, you know, as say senior management teams, on what is the arc of integration. So we have the arc of integration. This is how integrated your business is as a whole. So yeah, we have, you know, this arc. So if you've got a very narrow arc and you're only just focused on your own little bit of the world, that's not great, because performance is positively correlated to the breadth of the arc and the balance of the arc. So if you've got a narrow arc and it's like, okay, we're going to work really, really well with my, I don't know, my suppliers over here. Well, that's great, but hang on a minute, you're missing out your own organization and the customers. Or you get some businesses which are flipped the other way, and they're very much focused on the customers, but not so much on maybe their business and the suppliers. So then what we do is we broaden the arc out. So that becomes quite important as we're moving forward. Excuse me, just a quick drink as we're moving forward. So therefore, we have to really sort of reflect on this and move this forward. Excuse me. Now, the key is getting that broad and balanced arc within these systems. So that is something that we have to think through. And one of the things that I like to ask companies is as follows. Dear me, bit of a frog in my throat. So we ask the question, what is our arc of integration? That's internally and externally. So how well do you integrate internally, but also externally as a business? But here's a question for you as an individual. You as an individual, what is your arc of control? And I think this is a really interesting question, because I'll talk to supply chain directors and I'll say, well, what can you actually control? And they might say, all I can control are my outbound warehouses. That's the bit I'm responsible for. And maybe some vehicle movements between them. That's all I'm responsible for. That's the bit I can physically control. Okay? Whereas you'll talk to other supply chain directors and they'll say, well, actually, I can control procurement, inbound, right through to the manufacturing, and then out, through to outbound. That's the arc of control of the individual. But also, really importantly, we talk about the arc of influence. How does this occur within the supply chain, within your business and within your supply chain network? Do you, as a supply chain professional, for example, are you able to influence the product design, for example? Are you able to influence the type of services that you are going to be delivering to the customer in the future? Influence is really important. And what are the processes in your business to enable that influence to take place? Do you have regular meetings? Do you have sort of regular workshops, so on and so forth? How do you do this? Do you all come to Cranfield University and have a sort of a customized course, for example, where you're getting everybody together, in that environment to actually work on some ideas of how we can work together? But you need people from all sections of the business to be able to sort of make some of these things work. So influence becomes really important. And I would argue for 2035, we're going to see that the arcs of integration across supply chains are going to expand. We're going to also find that the skill sets required for individual managers, the control area, what we're going to be controlling may also expand, but also influence is going to be critical. How we manage and collaborate across the whole network is becoming really important as we move forward. So let's just take some examples here of some really other important things that are going to be on the board agenda as we move forward with this. So we're going to look at the whole issue of ESG risks. So this is the whole issue of environment, social and governance for 2035. So this is, let's just reflect on the electric vehicle supply chain. It circles the world. What people are starting to do, and you can see this here, I'm just going to open up my little pointery thing again, and my highlighter. Okay, what we can see here, what this is doing is it's looking at where the sources of key raw materials are. Okay, cobalt, lithium, bauxite, nickel, for example. And then what it's actually doing is showing, if you like, the reserves. In other words, the size of, how much of that stuff is in a particular geographic location. But also what they're starting to do is to categorize risks. You can see extreme risk, high risk, medium risk, and low risk on these various things. So these are all the things that we need to have in place to make these, to make this sort of, this battery move forward. This is where the resources are. Now, if we look at this, what you can now see is all the various flows that are taking place. So you can see, the Congo. From an ESG perspective, it is seen as high risk. Why? Because we've got something down here called artisanal mines. This is people who are basically digging stuff out of the ground and just sort of burning it and trying to extract, the ores and everything else which are taking place. And they're doing that. But you can also, we've even got high risk shipping routes which are taking place. You've got other areas, you've got Australia here. That's actually pretty low risk. Now, this all becomes really, really important to be able to actually understand, if you like, the risk profile of the supply chain as it actually circles the world. And what we're already seeing is, and this is why design becomes quite important, is that different technologies have different risk profiles. So you can see here for this particular battery technology, it has a higher risk profile than some of the other battery technologies. So this is what's taking place. And I've just, got this from, this is a few years old, but hey, this was really important because, Washington Post reported rampant child labor and human rights abuses enmeshed in the cobalt trade. Okay. So, this is seen as high risk within that environment. And they basically laid down a challenge to the big phone manufacturers, because we've all got lithium ion batteries in our Apple phones, and all phones need these lithium ion batteries. But the point was that then those organizations went out there, and you can see that Apple basically stated that they had actually got complete mapping of the supply chain at that particular point in time. Now, what we can then do is we can start mapping out the whole of, a particular product. So it's not just the battery, it's also everything else which goes into that finished product. So this is something that people are starting to think through. But why am I telling you about this in thinking about 2035? Because what we're already seeing is a massive trend which is taking place around this. So Institutional Investors Group calls for banks to set more ambitious ESG goals. And what that actually means is that if you're wanting to borrow money from banks, if you're a big organization wanting to borrow money, you're going to have to make sure that you meet certain ESG requirements. Make sure you're thinking about the environment, society, and governance through those supply chains. And we're already seeing a big trend taking place. So picking up on this one here, you can see that the approaches rose by 18% from 2019 to 2021. So, while the number of fund selectors using ESG strategies rose from, 65% to 77% over 3 years, but more importantly, some legislation has just gone through in Germany earlier this year, okay, and it's all about exploitation. And the point is labor or environmental abuses in your global supply chain. So as a director, you can be held account for labor or environmental abuses in your global supply chain. Challenge is many of us don't even know what our global supply chain looks like. So this is going to be a big thing that we need to start thinking about, mapping out where and getting transparency of that extended supply chain as we move forward. So for 2035, we're going to have to make sure we've got this one in place. Now, the next one is net zero 2050. It's already been set. In fact, some of these goals are even sooner, but this is just a breakdown from the Financial Times. Transport, you can see, a massive proportion of the CO2 we're producing. Also industry, we've got various other categories on this particular chart, which shows you where it is. And it's just a couple of years old, okay, in terms of what's going on. But when we start to think then about what's going on in terms of the percentage change which has been achieved, well, if we're looking at transport, we're not doing particularly well. Okay, we're not doing particularly well. And we've got to start thinking differently about transport and how we move things. Now, okay, we're talking about a move towards electric, but we know that the capabilities of, electric vehicles for, large loads and everything else is not quite there yet. So we're going to have to start thinking about really very much multimodal concepts in the way that we manage things out, perhaps using rail for some legs of a journey and then actually using HGV vehicles, battery powered HGV vehicles on other legs of the journey. But just think about this. Decisions you're making today on your warehouse, where you're putting the infrastructure in, have you got, if you like, the infrastructure and the power going into that warehouse facility, which will enable you to charge all these vehicles and so on and so forth? And I know that this is a big debate that we need to actually think through. And also, we've got to actually get the economy to be more net zero, just in terms of our power production as we move forward. So this becomes really quite an important challenge that we're having to deal with. So the other thing is the executive level debate. We've discovered some amazing things over the last 18 months, like we can actually do our jobs and we don't have to be in an office to do our jobs sometimes. So one of the big debates we're already seeing is this trade-off between infrastructure and property and information systems for some workers. So what we're seeing here is a shift from saying, how do we use these office spaces? I was talking to one of my neighbors actually who works for a big bank, and they're talking now about they're creating, if you like, communities and everything else. So they're saying, oh yes, you know, what do you want in terms of this community area? But what it means is a lot of the desks are going. It's a more collaborative space. And I said, oh, well, for my community, I think you need a pub, don't you? And a fish and chip shop and various other things like that. But, you know, these are the types of things that we're having to think through. How do we use that space? But if we're going to move to that model, we've also got to invest in information technology to enable virtual working. And then we've also got to think very carefully about the human resource management in a virtual world. How do we actually manage in a virtual world? And here are just a couple of examples I picked up on. KPMG investing 44 million, but they're closing offices down as well. So in other words, they're saying, hey, we're going to release a load of cash by not having those offices, but we're going to invest more in remote working. We've got Vodafone as well saying, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to have a work from home sort of model being developed as well. So all these things are coming to play. And I think we're going to see more and more of this as we move forward towards 2035. So building resilience for the new better. Just a couple of key things here. Procurement for resilience rather than for cost. That is one of the key things. We're going to be seeing on global supply chains explorations of onshoring, nearshoring, multi-shoring. You know, there's no point in having all your, all your supplies in one nation or one location, because if it goes into lockdown with a pandemic, that whole supply chain's been disrupted. So people are looking to spread risk, manage risk in different ways. We are definitely going to see, the whole issue here of, changes in our workplaces. Innovation is going to be essential. We can no longer do the things that we did before. But really key to all this is going to be collaboration as we move forward. So we need to have those things in place. And really finally, to conclude, if we're building resilience for 2035, make sure you understand that supply chain strategy. Think about your product and service design for the supply chain, because you'll lock a lot of the risk in at that particular stage of your supply chain. You've got to have collaboration. You've got to have agility. You've got to have a risk management culture. In other words, people ask the question, how will this decision impact on the risk profile of my supply chain? Think about the design and engineering, but capping all this off, supply chain transparency. There's going to be such a drive for total supply chain transparency through all sorts of technologies. Maybe technologies like blockchain we're going to see sort of evolving and maturing, being less environmentally impactful and so on and so forth. Continuous monitoring and intelligence also, thinking through those particular areas as well. So, lots of big issues there. If you want further information, this is really important. There will be available for a little while. iTunes has been taken down, but I've got a course on there which you can look at. Do have a look at my website. Plenty of stuff on YouTube. Go to the Cranfield University site and do feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn. I've also got a newsletter on LinkedIn which is all about supply chain innovation, which you may find interesting. So I'm just going to finish, leave you on this slide here. Thank you all very much. And I do hope that you took some ideas away which you can create economic, social, or environmental value to sustain your organizations to 2035.